Well, a week ago at this hour, we registered some real surprise that former Trump National Security Advisor Michael Flynn was not among the first three publicly announced people associated with the Trump campaign to be indicted by Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller, one of whom has already pleaded guilty, because Michael Flynn obviously broke the law. There's absolutely no doubt about that. He did not register as a foreign agent when he was working on behalf of the Turkish government during the Trump campaign in 2016, and that is a felony. Punishment can include prison time. The government doesn't usually prosecute these cases when it seems to have just been an oversight. Government can be kind of understanding about that. But when prosecutors are playing tough, as Robert Mueller is, this is the kind of thing that can and will get you indicted, as it did for Paul Manafort and his junior partner, Richard Gates. Count 10 of the indictment of Paul Manafort and Richard Gates says the defendants, Paul J. Manafort Jr. and Richard W. Gates III, knowingly and willfully, without registering with the Attorney General as required by law, acted as agents of a foreign principal, to wit, the government of Ukraine. Count 11 of that same indictment says that Manafort and Gates knowingly and willfully caused to be made a false statement of a material fact and omitted a material fact necessary to make the statements therein not misleading in a document filed with and furnished to the Attorney General under the provisions of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Hitting Michael Flynn with those two counts of an indictment has been, from the start, the easiest thing that Robert Mueller could possibly do, because Michael Flynn did not register as a foreign agent. But after he was fired from the Trump White House, when this kind of deception became public, Michael Flynn filed as a foreign agent in March of 2017 for work he had done the previous year. So that means Michael Flynn gave up any hope of trying to claim that he wasn't a foreign agent. That would be one way of defending himself, but he gave that up. But filing after you've done the work, especially when you're also working on a presidential campaign, when you did that work, is like stopping the car 10 miles after you went through a stop sign. And so tonight's news, which we've seen coming for most of the year, is that NBC News is reporting that Robert Mueller has gathered enough evidence to bring charges in the investigation of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and his son. And it is unclear just how much legal trouble Michael Flynn's son is in. But the father and son worked very closely together in Michael Flynn's company called Flynn Intel Group. An indictment would make Michael Flynn the first Trump White House official accused of a crime by Robert Mueller's team. Michael Flynn was fired after just 24 days as President Trump's national security advisor. The Trump administration insisted that it was for misleading the White House, in particular misleading poor Mike Pence about Michael Flynn's Russia contacts during the transition. But it has been documented that the White House had been warned about those contacts by Michael Flynn weeks before Michael Flynn was fired. So Michael Flynn was fired not because of what he did. No. Michael Flynn was fired only because what he did became public, or some of what he did became public. NBC News reports investigators are speaking to multiple witnesses in coming days to gain more information surrounding Flynn's lobbying work, including whether he laundered money or lied to federal agents about his overseas contacts, according to three sources familiar with the investigation. Mueller's team is also examining whether Flynn attempted to orchestrate the removal of a chief rival of Turkish President Recep Erdogan from the U.S. to Turkey in exchange for millions of dollars. NBC News reported 2 months ago that Michael Flynn's son, Michael G. Flynn, who is, irritatingly enough, not a junior, it's Michael G. Flynn, he is also subject to Robert Mueller's investigation. Quote, the inquiry into the younger Flynn is focused, at least in part, on his work with his father's lobbying firm, Flynn Intel Group. Both traveled to Russia in December 2015 when General Flynn gave a paid speech to the Russian propaganda network RT and had dinner with Vladimir Putin. Three sources familiar with the investigation tell NBC News Mueller is applying renewed pressure on Flynn following his indictment of Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort in June. Former FBI Director James Comey testified under oath that President Trump directed him to drop what was then the FBI's investigation into Michael Flynn.
I hope, this is the president speaking, I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go. He is a good guy. I hope you can let this go. Now, those are his exact words. Is that correct?
Correct. I mean, this is the President of the United States, with me alone, saying, I hope this. I took it as this is what he wants me to do.
NBC News reports if the elder Flynn is willing to cooperate with investigators in order to help his son, two of the sources said it could also change his own fate, potentially limiting any legal consequences. Joining us now, Julia Ainsley, national security and justice reporter for NBC News. She's one of the reporters who broke the Flynn news. Also with us, Eugene Robinson, Pulitzer Prize-winning opinion writer for The Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst. And Ron Klain, chief of staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore and a former senior aide to President Obama. He's also a former chief counsel of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Julia Ainsley, first to your reporting on the Flynn case, and I should say the Flynn cases, Michael Flynn the father, Michael Flynn the son.
Yes, I mean, what we're seeing here is a ramped up pressure on Michael T. Flynn, the father, because he's a very important part of this investigation for Robert Mueller. If you think about all of the work that Mueller's investigation has done over the past few months, pulling documents, all the data and figures that they need people who can fill in these gaps, who can tell the narrative of how closely the Trump campaign may have worked with Russia leading up to this election. And Michael T. Flynn, the father, can do that because he worked on the campaign and he also was the national security advisor. So he's in a position almost more so than someone like Paul Manafort would be or George Papadopoulos to be able to give that key information. And this pressure is ramping up on him because of those charges, because of the things that they're looking into, like you just read, Lawrence, and because his son is now involved. His son was his partner, worked with him when he was lobbying and as he was national security advisor. And so he has the same information the father would. And so we're thinking here that Mueller is trying to apply pressure to Flynn to get him to cooperate, to give him those details he needs to flesh out this narrative by putting pressure on both him and his son. It's a very smart prosecutorial move, if you think about it, if you're trying to get a witness to cooperate. The other key piece of this, of course, is whether or not Flynn used his position as national security advisor to push for the removal of Gulen. That, of course, is Fethullah Gulen, the Muslim cleric who is an opponent of Turkish President Erdogan. That, of course, would be a huge breach and completely illegal to allow another country to bribe. We understand that he may have been offered millions of dollars to allow another country to bribe someone in a position to influence that policy. Those decisions, whether it be extradition or other means, are not supposed to come from someone at the White House. They're supposed to come through diplomatic, non-political channels.
And, Julia, I want you to keep reading the Carter Page transcript, which I know you have in front of you. We're going to come back to you on that in just a moment. I want to go to Gene Robinson, Gene, to talk about where the jury that really matters is on this, and that is, of course, American voters. We have a very important new poll out tonight, a CNN poll, showing that 64% view the Russia investigation as a serious matter. 32% see it as an attempt to discredit Donald Trump. And I think we know exactly who those 32% are and who they might have voted for president. And there's another piece of this poll I want you to consider, Gene, which is 59% say they believe that Trump knew that his associates were in contact with Russians during the campaign. 59% think that Donald Trump knew that. 35% say no. 6 have no opinion. But those are pretty powerful numbers, Gene, politically for the way this story is unfolding.
Yeah, what those numbers tell me, Lawrence, is that this Russia story is getting through. It's somehow making its way through all the noise and the blizzard of tweets. And you know, we're in this news cycle where 15 things seem to happen every day. And you do wonder if anything really sticks, if anything really cuts through the noise. And I think it's clear that that people get the Russia story, that people understand there were these untoward contacts. There's a lot we don't know, but a lot that's very suspicious. We know that Donald Trump Jr. at the very least tried his damnedest to collude with the Russians, so I think this is all pretty bad news for the president.
Ron Klain, talk about this father-son investigation and how prosecutors approach a situation like this, where the father is clearly the principal, but the son might have some criminal liability there, and you want to try to use the emotional pressures that could exist on this for both of them.
Well, there's no question that Bob Mueller is going to use the fact, I mean, let's not get sympathetic here, that the Michael Flynn, the son, engaged in criminal acts. And so he has criminal exposure because he did bad things. And Bob Mueller is going to use that to try to exert pressure on his father to cooperate. You know, one fact out in that poll, Lawrence, is that 100% of the people named Donald Trump should be scared to death of Michael Flynn's indictment, because he really brings this to the White House steps in three important ways. I mean, first, it is the first time a senior White House aide will be indicted since Watergate, and that's a historically sad event. Second, Trump cut off these other people, or at least says he cut off these other people, but he was still communicating with and praising on Twitter Mike Flynn after he fired him. And third, and most importantly, if you're going to make an obstruction case against Donald Trump for firing Jim Comey, what was the crime that investigation that Trump was trying to obstruct? And if you once you indict Michael Flynn, that's the crime that Donald Trump, the investigation which Donald Trump was trying to obstruct, when he directed Comey to stop and then fired him for not stopping the investigation.
So, Ron, from the President Trump perspective, Michael Flynn really is possibly the most important player in this whole thing, because that is where an obstruction of justice case would reside.
Exactly. I mean, I think the only thing scary would be Mueller coming after Jared Kushner, because he has a lot of the same exposure, and he's his family. But I think other than family, this is the most perilous indictment for Donald Trump.
Julia, we need your speed reading assessment of the Carter Page transcript. This is a House Intelligence Committee interview conducted of Carter Page on Thursday. What do we know at this point? I know it's hundreds of pages long, so
It is. Luckily, I have the help of a lot of my colleagues here at NBC. We're all sort of piecing this apart and going through it and sharing with each other sort of the first things that are standing out. And right now, I can tell you the first thing that's jumping out are how many people on the Trump campaign knew that Carter Page was going to Russia in July of 2016. So far, that looks like Corey Lewandowski, J.D. Gordon, Hope Hicks, Sam Clovis, and Jeff Sessions. A piece that I was charged with looking over showed that Jeff Sessions had heard that Carter Page was going. He said, of course, in passing, almost everything, seems like every conversation Carter Page had during the year of 2016 was in passing. If you look at some of these, if you look at the interview that he had with the House Intelligence Committee, but it seems clear that a lot of these people, including people like Sessions, who have said that they had no knowledge of anyone on the campaign ever talking to Russians, it's clear that that's going to be a harder position to defend based on this transcript.
And Gene Robinson, this is one of those characters in this story that is hard to imagine, that fiction writers would have trouble coming up with this particular character. The one who is so strangely talkative in television interviews when everyone thinks he should be quiet, and it turns out he does have to adjust his story as things move along.
Yeah, he does. This is very weird. You'd never invent this character, as you said. And you always, when I listen to him, I always wonder, is he playing some sort of ultra sophisticated four-dimensional chess, or is he an idiot? And I mean,
so wait, Gene, those are the choices, okay?
Yeah,
that's
I know.
It?
And
right,
those are basically the choices.
All right,
and so
you go
we'll
ahead.
find
I'm going
out.
to think about it. All right. Go ahead, Gene. Sorry.
No, I mean, I'm leaning toward the latter, but we'll see. You know, we'll see. This is Ron mentioned one thing though that I think we're all keeping our eye on, and because obviously the step beyond Michael Flynn that could indeed be closer to the president is Jared Kushner. He, after all, was at that meeting at Trump Tower with Donald Trump Jr. and Paul Manafort, and he was in charge of the data operation of the Trump campaign. The Russians, in a sophisticated way, targeted voters. How did they know who to target? You know, this is a question that I think Bob Mueller will try to answer for us.
I want to go to a moment of Michael Flynn at the Republican convention actually saying, lock her up, about Hillary Clinton, because I actually think it is an important factor in how prosecutors view him. Let's watch this one more time.
We do not need a reckless president who believes she is above the law. Lock her up. That's right. That's right. Lock her up.
And he went on, Ron, and of course he famously said if he did 1/10 of what she did, that he would be in prison already. Now, this is someone who the FBI had investigated, had concluded, as Director Comey said publicly, that there was not a prosecutable case there. So that is an attack on the judgment of the Justice Department and the FBI when he's saying it. That's who is investigating him now. How do they feel about something like that when they look at that?
Well, I think it's certainly not going to help him. And I think that his defiance and direct criticism of federal law enforcement in that clip certainly doesn't help him. But, you know, these people are professionals. They are not going after Mike Flynn out of some kind of grudge or some kind of revenge play. They're going after Mike Flynn because he broke the law. And he probably broke multiple laws, and he knew he had done it when he was giving that speech. And that's really unbelievably offensive, and I hope that when he is on house arrest after he's arrested and he doesn't make bail, they make him watch that clip over and over and over again in his living room while he's awaiting the meting out of justice here.
Such a good point, Ron, and I just want to remind the audience of that, too. Whenever you see those clips of Michael Flynn with the locker up, always remember, he knew that as he stood there that night saying those things, he himself was in violation of federal law. He absolutely knew that. Julia Ainsley, Eugene Robinson, Ron Klain, thank you all very much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Mueller has a grand jury, and now he wants documents. This late-breaking story from the New York Times tonight, Friday. Mueller's investigators bearing down on Michael Flynn's financial ties abroad, now asking the White House for documents related to Flynn, and they've questioned witnesses about whether he was secretly paid by the Turkish government during the final months of the Trump presidential campaign. This, according to people close to the investigation who spoke with the Times tonight. Now, the request is reportedly not yet any kind of formal subpoena, but it is, to be clear, a new step. Quote, the document request is the first known instance of Mueller's team asking the White House to hand over records. And President Trump's lawyers know that any resistance to this would only speed up Mueller leaning on the grand jury that everyone's been talking about for subpoenas or testimony. Now, that's the process. Here is the actual criminal issue tonight. Mueller looking at how Flynn worked with a Turkish-American businessman. Flynn's business was reportedly paid $530,000, that's a lot of money, to run a kind of a political-type campaign that would attack the opponent of the current Turkish government. Now, the Times wants to know if this was a secret government contract, and Mueller wants to know, quote, if the Flynn Intel Group made kickbacks to the businessmen for helping conceal the source of the money. Now, you may remember, if you have watched our coverage, that Flynn already violated the federal rules on registering as a foreign agent. He later conceded that in order to update his filing. What this new request tonight is about is it suggests to us that the special counsel is further following the money. The New York Times saying that these hidden payments could potentially be considered for fraud charges. Now, all these developments come as NBC News confirmed today with 3 sources familiar with the matter that Bob Mueller has been making use of more than one active grand jury. This is in multiple districts, so that includes Virginia and D.C., the big story that broke yesterday. And those grand juries are issuing subpoenas for records and documents tied to the ongoing investigation. We have a lot to get to tonight. I'm happy to say a strong panel to begin. Walter Dellinger served as Assistant Attorney General and head of the Office of Legal Counsel through 1996, acting Solicitor General thereafter. Sam Buell is a professor of law at Duke University, a former federal prosecutor, lead prosecutor, in fact, for that Enron task force, which has some overlap with some of what Mueller is doing now. And Michael Isikoff, a chief investigative reporter for Yahoo News. Walter, folks are just digesting the New York Times report, coming here on a Friday night like so much news has broken. We're looking at it in our newsroom. Folks at home may want to understand, what does it mean when we say this is one of the first document requests that Mueller sent to the White House?
Well, it means a couple of things. One, I think, Ari, in a later segment, we're going to wonder how this information got out of the White House and into the New York Times. But on the information itself, I think it shows how a good faith prosecutor cannot keep narrowly to Russian influence on the election as his mandate, because the whole financial web is so interconnected. A prosecutor who wanted to know whether there were, for example, Russian payments being made to officials in the campaign would want to see if there's a pattern or practice within the Flynn group, for example, of getting covert payments from foreign governments. So I think it shows how I think the money chain is going to be followed and is potentially quite serious.
Well, you raise that point, and Sam, you know, as a former prosecutor, bringing charges is not just about crimes. There are a lot of unsolved crimes out there that never get charges. It's always about having evidence. And these financial crimes seem to have a lot more evidence. I want to read to you what a colleague of yours who's done the same job, Preet Bharara, is saying here tonight. Quote, if true, this request for White House documents regarding Flynn's work for Turkey, much more significant than what he calls breathless reporting about the grand jury. Why is this significant, and how does it relate to the evidence trail?
Well, because the most important evidence that you get in any kind of complex case like this, particularly a white-collar case, is the testimony of witnesses who really know what happened. Were in the key meetings, had conversations with people, and the way that you get that testimony is you build cases against those witnesses. People are not going to volunteer to testify in a case like this. And I think what's very interesting about this reporting in the New York Times tonight is it suggests the possibility, I'm speculating, but the possibility that Michael Flynn is being targeted as a potential witness in this investigation. The stronger the case you build against him, the more likely that you might ultimately obtain his cooperation. And he may know about lots of other transactions that the special counsel would be interested in looking at.
Does that potential have any impact on how prosecutors and investigators would look at what Jim Comey described as Donald Trump's keen interest in getting the dogs to back off of Flynn?
Well, I think that, we've all said all along with regard to the potential obstruction of justice charges in this case that the backing off on Flynn was in part a potential effort on behalf of the president to reduce his own legal jeopardy, because it was clear from the beginning that Flynn was an important individual in this network, in this whole fabric, and a potential witness. So if, in fact, it did turn out that a case were made, and now we're several steps down the road, but if it turned out that a case were made against Flynn, and ultimately his testimony were obtained in some fashion, whether through cooperation or perhaps compelling him into a grand jury and immunizing him ultimately, something like that, or even convicting him and then taking his testimony, well, then that would certainly cast the obstruction of justice case against the president with regard to asking Comey to drop the investigation of Flynn in a much starker light.
Michael, why is this coming out now?
Well, because Mueller is stepping up his investigation. He's requesting documents from the White House, and inevitably that's going to come out. There's 2 points that I think are significant here. First of all, the fact that Mueller is following the trail relating to Turkey is not that big of a surprise, given that, if you remember, on Election Day, Michael Flynn publishes an article in The Hill urging the United States to extradite Erdogan, Erdogan's main enemy, Gulen, from Pennsylvania to Turkey. That was the chief goal of the Turkish government. Now, in that op-ed, Michael Flynn was not identified as a lobbyist for the Turkish government or a Turkish-American businessman who had an interest in this. It just popped. It later, investigative reporting uncovered his ties to this Turkish-American businessman who had close ties to the Erdogan government, and that inevitably led people to follow the money trail and for him to retroactively register as a lobbyist for the Turkish government. So it's not a surprise that Mueller would focus on this, but I think it's absolutely right. The important thing here is the leverage that a case about Flynn and Turkey could give Mueller in the core Russia investigation. If they can threaten Flynn with serious criminal charges, they've got leverage to get his cooperation, and then he's so central to everything to do with Russia, including those conversations with the Russian ambassador, and including the obstruction of justice allegations, since, as you noted before, it was Trump's bringing up and request to Comey to let Flynn go that ultimately led to Comey's firing.
Right, that's what we were just saying. I mean, Walter, what is the theory of the case then for investigators? That Flynn is vulnerable and that's why you're moving on him, or that he might be involved in two sets of crimes, something about Turkey and something about Russia, but you're willing to let them both go if he cooperates?
It sounds like both. I think Sam and Mike make the point quite convincingly about why you can't create the red lines that President Trump said he wanted to have to confine Mueller's investigation narrowly to, quote, Russian involvement. That's not the way prosecutors operate, as Sam and Mike noted. So I think this is a case that amply demonstrates that what the prosecutor is looking at is financial influence on those who are running the Trump campaign. As someone who became the national security advisor, and you can't artificially separate that out from what connections there might be with Russia. It both shows sort of motive and operation on Flynn's part, potentially, and it also provides the kind of leverage that we're talking about.
And all of this, Michael, is against a backdrop of increasing attacks on the entire special counsel system. Take a listen here to Newt Gingrich.
Of course the White House should be concerned. First of all, anybody who has any doubts about corruption in the Justice Department ought to read Sidney Powell's book, Licensed to Lie, which is a tremendous study of both Senator Stevens being destroyed by the Justice Department and the whole Enron Arthur Anderson case, both of which were basically corrupt. I worry about the government having the kind of power. And notice what Mueller's doing. He's changing the targets. He was supposedly going to look into Russian collusion. The articles this morning say, gee, it looks like Russian collusion is going to be hard to prove, maybe because it didn't happen.
Michael?
It is extraordinary that the president's allies are attacking Bob Mueller, a former Republican assistant attorney general under George H.W. Bush's administration, nominated by President George W. Bush as FBI director, kept on by President Obama for a couple of years. I mean, he is as nonpartisan a figure as you can get. It seems to those of us who have followed Bob Mueller for many, many years, highly unusual to hear these kind of attacks on his integrity at this point. But on the other hand, this is what White Houses do when they are facing special counsel investigations. They go after the special counsel.
Well, and you said he's nonpartisan, Sam. Another way to put it is to the extent that he has had affiliations with a party, it's the Republican Party. That's where he was rising as an appointee, at least when he was taking over FBI and whatnot. He mentions Enron, which you have Newt Gingrich does, which you have a connection to as well, and so does Mueller. I guess the opposition research is kicking around. You can't do the whole topic justice, but anything you want to say about the Enron task force here? Because it's something that Republicans seem to think is a kind of a vulnerability for Mueller.
Well, it's ironic, Ari, because the Enron task force was created at the instigation of the Bush Justice Department. John Ashcroft was the Attorney General at the time. Larry Thompson was the Deputy AG, and they certainly consulted with the White House as to how that case ought to be handled. And the conclusion was, let's have a very vigorous task force, and let's wall it off from the White House and let it do its job, notwithstanding the fact that some of the targets of that investigation had been major campaign contributors to the Bush administration. And I think it was understood, we need to cut ourselves off from these people and let the law run its course. And it's just, we are in a different world now. And, I understand what Michael's saying about being surprised, but at a certain point, it's now August. We've been being surprised by things since, January. The norms are out the window. I mean, at some point, we have to start to accept the fact that this is normal now, the new normal for how the White House is going to behave. And I think that Mueller's people and Mueller himself can be under no illusions. They are going to be absolutely savagely attacked at every turn in everything they do in this investigation.
Right.
And it's going to be their professionalism.
Yeah, you're saying let's not act so surprised every night, kind of a Maya Angelou test for the Trump era. If someone shows you who they are, believe them. And I understand her to have meant that negatively, as in when someone is betraying you or unethical. Walter Dellinger, final point I think a lot of people at home may be wondering about when it comes to Flynn's potential cooperation. And I'll ask it to you as a hypothetical because we're not presupposing anything about what Flynn will or won't do. But if you have someone who's already lawyered up, as he has, and who's written a letter saying, oh, I could cooperate, I got a story to tell, his words, then what would happen if a deal was struck? Because obviously the FBI can't just jump him, right? You try to bring him to the grand jury, or you try to cut a deal. How would it work?
Well, you would make an agreement that he would perhaps plead to lesser crimes than they might ultimately charge in exchange for his cooperation in providing testimony against others, perhaps his superior. And I think that he could be, if there were crimes committed in relation to the campaign and the Russians, he could be a devastatingly important witness if that were the case.
Fascinating. I want to thank Sam Buell for joining us. Mike and Walter, we are going to come back to you.